Before we get started, I'm curious how many of you are actually Windows Forms developers? Okay, so this is probably a good talk for you to be in. How many of you are already Silverlight developers as well? 2 of you. Okay, also, I think this is probably a good talk for most of you to be in. I put a little note up there that, just a warning that this talk was going to be full of kind of sweeping generalizations about your code. I don't mean that in a mean way. I mean that in I'm going to put up a demo here and you're going to look at it and go, I would never create a Windows Forms application that looked like that. And that's okay, because I did. And that's the demo that I'm going to use here. I guess we'll get started. So let me get this down here. My name is Pete Brown, and I work, or I lead the developer community team at Microsoft. So I've got the pleasure of managing Jesse Liberty and John Galloway and Joe Stagner. And I also do a lot of WPF and Silverlight work myself, and not actually contributing code to the code base. They won't let me do that. I don't think you'll see here when you see my code, you'll see why they won't let me contribute to the code base. But I do a lot of content for Silverlight.net and demos for WindowsClient.net, as well as talks like this and whatnot. And what I have for you today is we're going to talk a bit about what it takes to move both applications and skills, and probably more importantly skills, over from Windows Forms to Silverlight. Talk a little bit about some of the areas that you're going to run into issues with. Talk a little bit about decision points between when you want to move to Silverlight versus WPF, something that I think will be helpful for you all. And then we're going to take the second half of this talk and we're going to port as much of an application as we can. So it all totally depends upon the time. I encourage you to, I'll save a little bit of time here for questions at the end. If I don't manage to save time for it, come up and talk to me. I'll also be around here afterwards as well. All right, so let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is demo an application for you. So I think that's always a good way to start off a presentation. So here is my Windows Forms application. I made it MDI, because everybody still builds MDI apps, right? Yeah, okay. I made it an MDI application with a simple pop-up here that lets me find a customer. So I can type in a customer name, what they start with anyway. And it's going to a local database, and I can pull up this customer here. And then I have a very simple data entry form. I can let me pull up a different one here. Find customer central. Oops. There we go. And there it is. There we go. All right, so, and I have sales orders in here, and then I have a simple list over on the right that lists the details of that sales order. So what I want to show you how to do here today is taking an application that's like this, moving it over to Silverlight, seeing what's going to change between the two, seeing what the structure of the application will be like, incorporating a little bit of simplified MVVM, incorporating some techniques for doing this in parallel with keeping your existing application up and running, so more of a phased migration approach, as well as saving the data back to the database, and if we have time, doing things like Word, mail merge, and whatnot. Okay? There is a lot of code at the end of this, so if you didn't get a coffee, I encourage you to just go grab one now. So first of all, the question is, why would you move to Windows Forms? Move from Windows Forms, excuse me. How many of you are not convinced yet that you should move away from Windows Forms? How many of you are too shy to answer that question? Yeah, okay. Well, actually, that's really good. I'm excited to see that a lot of you are already interested in the move, and you've kind of made some sort of a decision that you think you want to move towards Silverlight or WPF. I think some of the reasons you might want to do that, besides it being a more modern platform that's getting more activity and more development and more resources at Microsoft, it allows you to do some very practical things. How many of you have had to override WM Paint or the equivalent events in Windows Forms applications to customize the UI? Right? And that code is totally awesome when you look at it, right? It's like a giant pile of lines and GDI canvases and all sorts of other fun stuff that tend to be a bit of a mess. And that's because Windows Forms was never really designed with the idea that you want to have complete and absolute control over the way the UI is presented. It was more designed to, you want to build standardized Windows applications. Well, since we created Windows Forms, the world has moved on a bit and moved away from having these standardized Battleship Gray applications to more customized experiences, both on the web, with consumers, and also inside behind the firewall. How many of you attended either one of my Silverlight 5 talks? Shame on the rest of you. You can watch it online later. It'll be online later. I showed some things in those Silverlight 5 talks that I think are very compelling from business scenarios. I showed being able to use data templates to show different types of data in the same list box and have it automatically apply those templates in the list box or any place else in your application for reuse of styles and reuse of UI. So I think those types of things really help us out in terms of efficiency and enforcing the standards of our application across the application code. And truthfully, we're not doing a whole lot at Microsoft with Windows Forms right now. It's not dead. I always hate to use the word dead. We support these products forever and ever and ever. We're just, we're doing what it takes to keep it working for you all, fixing bugs, doing stuff like that. We're just not adding new features at this point to Windows Forms, whereas we are with Silverlight and WPF. So there are a few options that you can choose for which direction you want to move. How many of you think you should move to WPF with your current application? How many are you, how many of you are doing that just because somebody said so? Yeah, there's two guys in the back. Okay, thank you for your honesty. I really appreciate it. Silverlight and WPF both have pros and cons in terms of which one you want to pick. If you're looking to move from Windows Forms in a phased approach, doing just like part of an application at a time, typically WPF is going to be an easier move for you because it has support for being able to include parts of your Windows Forms application hosted with the WPF code, also with HTML and with DirectX and a bunch of other stuff. So it's a really great integration technology. Silverlight has some other really interesting things. How many of you have used RIA services, WCF RIA services? Okay, there's also a talk or a couple of talks that were here that you'll want to take a look at the videos when those are posted online on how to use WCF RIA services. For many of you, WCF RIA services and or LightSwitch, which builds upon that, are going to be the right choice for helping you move your Windows Forms applications over to Silverlight. Silverlight also has things like validation and control templates. You can use iDispatch, COM automation, woohoo, right? You can use COM automation to get out of the Silverlight sandbox and access things on the local machine. And there's some really great tools out there, such as the native extensions for Silverlight that build upon this iDispatch support to give you additional access to the local machine. However, if you find yourself doing lots and lots of that, you probably want to step over and look at WPF because you don't want your whole application to be just iDispatch support and pinvoke when Silverlight 5 comes out. All right. I mentioned WCF RIA services. Definitely check that out. WCF RIA services is a technology that is not a data access layer. It's easily confused for one, but it uses some data access layer that you have provided, typically an ORM, Entity Framework, and Hibernate, something like that. And it provides an easy way to make these service calls across the tiers and to get your business rules migrated from the server to the client without you having to code them in both places, right? So it does a really good job of getting those rules across there and abstracting out all these asynchronous service calls that you have to deal with in Silverlight. And that works with Silverlight 4 and 5. It is not supported in WPF, so if you decide to go with RIA services and you want to use the whole thing of RIA services, you're looking at a Silverlight solution. If you just want to use RIA services as a way to host a service and host data, then you can use that from just about anything, ASP.NET as well. Visual Studio LightSwitch, any of you used it? All right, how many people don't want to admit they used it because they heard it was for business guys? No, all right. So we've kind of positioned LightSwitch as a way for your uber business people. The one that built the mission critical Excel application that's running over there in the corner of one of the departments that you're called to support every so often. And you look and it's got 8,000 lines of VBA behind the scenes and a bunch of macros and other stuff that you have to deal with, right? We know you don't like to work with those, and we know that those are a pain to maintain. So we did start off with LightSwitch and saying, hey, those guys that are that technical and can write that VBA code, let's get them to write something that you can pull forward into Visual Studio anyway. So LightSwitch lets them build these forms over data applications. It creates Silverlight WCF RIA services applications that you can then take and pull into Visual Studio if LightSwitch doesn't have all the functionality that they need. Now, what we've also found out since then is Windows Forms developers trying to get into Silverlight. I'm sure you folks get the type of application request, on a Wednesday afternoon. Hey, I need this maintenance application that's going to go and update all these form fields and allow us to input some data. And oh, by the way, I need to test it on Friday morning type of request, right? Once in a while. Visual Studio Light Switch will let you do that. It's a really good, very quick tool for being able to build those kinds of applications. And once again, I want to say, once you get your code in there, it's not like it's locked into Light Switch. You could pull it into Visual Studio proper afterwards and continue to maintain it if you want. I'd already mentioned native extensions for Silverlight. That's also something good to check out. More interestingly than the actual extensions that are provided by the native extensions for Silverlight is the approach that they took to deploying these Calm automation servers to the client. So the native extensions for Silverlight includes in the install package by default for your application, the ZAP for your application, an MSI that is in there as a resource, right? And it has code that checks to see if the native extensions are registered on that machine. If they're not registered on that machine, optionally, it can install that MSI for you. It extracts it from the ZAP, runs and does the installation of the MSI for you. In a lockdown environment, that's not going to work so well because it does require local administrative privileges to do that MSI install. But for many types of applications, that's actually pretty convenient. And I think you might want to look at that as a mechanism by which you can get additional functionality onto the client if you're building a large Silverlight application, but really need to integrate with, say, this USB device over here or this particular device that we just didn't know about ahead of time. There are a number of challenges when you're trying to move from Windows Forms, not the least of which are third-party controls. I assume a lot of you are using third-party controls in Windows Forms. Many times, those controls, depending upon how old they are, simply do not have one-to-one equivalents in Silverlight or WPF. So when you're looking at how to reuse the UI and you're trying to do something that looked the way it did in Windows Forms, you're probably going to have to take some extra effort to actually go through that process. Or you're going to see that this third-party control had this awesome filtering, grouping, sorting functionality built into this grid by default. If you can't find a third-party control that does that for you in a kind of equivalent Silverlight way, then you're going to have to build a lot of that yourself. Now again, if it's just visuals, you can get away with a lot of stuff by styling and templates, but if it's actual functionality or API surface area, then those are changes you're going to have to take into account. And of course, the behavior is usually different. Most Windows Forms controls have lots of different properties in there for setting different colors and background colors for every other row in a grid and a bunch of other stuff. And the model that you use in Silverlight to work with that is totally different than what you would have in Windows Forms. Local databases. How many of you build applications that have a local database right on that machine? Okay. Local databases are not supported in Silverlight, so that might be an issue for you. Not getting to your data can be an issue, right? So you can use WPF in those cases, or again, you can go and try and write something like these Calm automation servers if it's important for you to use Silverlight. And there's always an escape valve that you can use. But we do not have, at this point in time, local database support in Silverlight. As a matter of fact, in Silverlight, we cannot actually connect directly to a database at all. Everything needs to go through some sort of a service. Right? And that's one of the big differences between probably what you're used to and what Silverlight supports. There's no support for ADO record sets for the same reason. You cannot connect directly to a database in Silverlight. How many of you are writing applications that get ADO record sets from services? All right, you can leave. No, that's okay. We used to do that, and a lot of times we use typed data sets and a bunch of other stuff for that. And that was a really good pattern way back. What's happened since then is there was a lot of traction in the ORM space and a lot of move towards having these plain old COM objects or CLR objects, POCOs that represent the entities that you're going to use in your application. Whether or not those are filled from an ORM explicitly or you fill them via record sets, operations, and stuff on the server is entirely up to you. But that's the type of object that you want to work with in Silverlight. Now, WPF, you can use ADO record sets, but most of the new controls and stuff and third-party things don't have great support for that. They're also expecting you to use entities or POCOs or something along those lines. And then finally, if you did a lot of that GDI drawing code and it's more than just trying to pretty up the user interface, you're trying to, say, draw a graph in real time or something like that, that's not supported in Silverlight currently. However, with Silverlight 5, which will be out sometime before the end of the year, we do have the XNA 3D API, and you can use the 3D API as a 2D API as well. So if you don't want to do retain mode stuff, or you have to update points in real time to show a graph or anything like that, you will be able to do that in XNA. It is a bit of a learning curve because it's a different model than what you had in GDI. If you want to reuse those components in a WPF application, if you've encapsulated your GDI code into a reusable user control or something, you'll be able to use that in a WPF application, just not in a Silverlight application. So I became a manager just like 8 months ago, and I was told I don't include enough graphs in my presentations to people. So here is a graph. All right, I think this is good. I tried to really take some anecdotal evidence and my past experience. I've worked at Microsoft for a year and a half, and I did real work before then, doing consulting and working in companies building real applications, Windows Forms, WPF, and Silverlight. And so I've had a chance to both look at a lot of different Windows Forms applications and Silverlight apps, as well as port some myself. And I found that in the graph of reuse versus rewrite, things like forms and UI stuff is generally rewrite. Things like network services, if you're doing it in WPF, you can reuse a lot of that. If you're doing it in Silverlight, there's a pretty good chance that if your internal network is kind of heavy on SOA, it might be using protocols that Silverlight doesn't understand. Data access code, in most cases in Silverlight, you're going to have to rewrite that for the reasons I articulated a few minutes ago. Pure business logic, if your business logic is truly independent and doesn't make calls out to other database services or anything like that, you can reuse a lot of that. But quite honestly, most of the applications I've seen aren't structured in such a nice atomic way. They do have database access code and stuff inside some of the rules for doing validation. So some of that might be a little bit harder to use. But pure logic, you can pull right over. It's all .NET. Device access is going to be a rewrite, because you're either going to have to rewrite it in COM in Silverlight, or use some of the pinvoke stuff that's coming in Silverlight 5 by the end of the year. WPF, you can use that just straight. Local file access, I think you can access a lot with local files in Silverlight, especially now with the upcoming Silverlight 5 out-of-browser, or both in-browser and out-of-browser trusted applications. You have a lot fewer restrictions in terms of what you can access. So I would even change that very slightly if you're talking specifically about Silverlight 5. WPF, of course, you install it. It has the same code access security model that you're used to in Windows Forms, so anything you could have done in Windows Forms for the most part, you could do in WPF. Custom controls, navigation, those things are also things that you're going to end up changing. So here's how to choose. I've called this the career limiting slide, because no matter what I put on here, there's going to be some team at Microsoft that's angry at me. If you would pick WPF if you want to integrate forms or integrate other stuff, or do a phased migration in a vertical sense for your application. So you want to have Windows Forms UI side by side with WPF UI. Okay. In addition, if you have to do any sort of deep system integration or build ISV applications, think large CAD type applications, or if Microsoft, we've built Visual Studio, the Blend products, things that are coming in some of the upcoming server products and whatnot. We've built a lot of that in WPF. So if you're that type of a customer, you're our primary target for WPF applications. Silverlight is what we're targeting more towards business applications. How many of you in here are not business application developers? A few of you. How many of you are game developers? Damn. No? Oh, well. Too bad. I had some cool 3D stuff that I showed in Silverlight, as well as some sound effects that are just fun if you're a game developer. But that's okay. I understand. Not too many game developers are coming to a Windows Forms session, I don't think. All right, so Silverlight's also good for apps that don't need deep system integration, right? And it's really good for advanced media scenarios, so the stuff that HTML can't do with HTML5. So think IIS smooth streaming, think chunking up some of the media so that you can get true HD. That's all stuff that Silverlight can do a lot better than HTML can at this point. And of course, if you're coding for Windows Phone 7 and you want to have a native application on Windows Phone 7, Silverlight is the way to go, as well as, of course, XNA. And then for that webby stuff, for the things that you want to do that are more complex than dancing babies and animated hamsters and stuff like that, and all the cool things that come along with the web, we are targeting that more at broad reach. So you remember you might have heard about the debacle last year where everybody's like, oh no, Silverlight's dead, we're only going HTML. That's absolutely not the case. What we were trying to articulate, and quite honestly didn't do a very good job of saying, is we are targeting HTML for very broad reach applications. So if you want to have the maximum exposure for your application, you want to be on the maximum number of devices, we're not telling you anything new. You're going to build that in HTML. There's more effort to that. It just happens to be that the platform supports it. You're still going to have to do a fair bit of different browser testing and side-by-side code and all that type of stuff. Although the browsers and the HTML specs and also things like shims and polyfills and whatnot have made that much easier since then. Of course, broad reach mobile, content applications, basic media, those are all things that you're going to look at for HTML as well. I mentioned a bit about phased migrations. And this is a little bit of what I was talking about. So a phased migration approach for a big application might be to port the back end first, right? And then have, say, both Windows Forms and Silverlight or WPF point to that same back end. So you've got some services there, data access layer stuff. And then port the middle tier and your logic. Factor those out, and you can also share that code between Silverlight and Windows Forms in many cases, and then finally work on the UI. So that's sort of like a horizontal slice approach that you would take with Silverlight. And of course, as you're going through this, you're not going to want to recreate exactly the same user interface that you had in Windows Forms. You're going to want to take advantage of what Silverlight and WPF can offer to create a new user interface that looks more modern, looks nicer, supports the users better, is more usable, has a better experience, etc. So in Silverlight, this is what I'm talking about, the layers here. And the reason why you can only do this port by layers is because Silverlight can't mix native code or WPF code or Windows Forms code alongside itself. Silverlight can mix Silverlight, and that's about it. WPF is what allows you to have a lot more side-by-side code. But then why would you pick Silverlight at all in this case? And quite honestly, it's because we have a lot more traction for Silverlight in the business application space, and we're going to be doing a lot more specifically for business application developers in Silverlight, whereas WPF, we're moving more towards these ISV applications. You could still certainly use WPF for those applications, but we have more traction on the Silverlight side. All right. Any questions before we actually start building an application? None at all. Everybody's asleep. Didn't they give you guys cookies or something before this? No, nothing like that. All right, so let me pull up the final version of this application here. So let me go over here to back up, final, and run this. Oh, yes, thank you. One of these days I'll figure that out. This is my last talk at TechEd, so I'm sure I'll have it figured out by the end of this talk. All right, so I want you to see what we're going to build before we actually start building it. Let me start this. All right, so this is the Silverlight application that's based on the Windows Forms application we saw earlier. I'm using just one of the default templates that I was able to download. And if I want to find a customer here, I can go in and say name starts with and say central. Find that just like I did before. Have it pull up. It's going to be a little bit slower because I have to go through a web service to get the data. It's not a direct data access. And here we go with the data that's on there. I also have persistence in here and support for doing mail merge in Microsoft Word. So if I do a form letter here, I think many of us have gotten this form letter, right, that usually starts off with that, at so-and-so company, we really care about your privacy, and then it's 12 pages of all the ways they're going to violate your privacy. So here's the form letter that we're going to send out here. Okay? And that's all happening from a Silverlight out-of-browser application. Everybody good? All right. I'll take the silence as a yes. All right, so we started off with this Windows Forms application, and the first thing I want to do here is add a Silverlight application to this. So I'm going to add to the same solution a Silverlight project. So if I go to Silverlight, I have this Silverlight navigation with Windows 7 theme template. I simply downloaded this using the online templates. It was free. It's up in our gallery. So I choose Silverlight navigation with Windows 7 theme. This is actually a Silverlight 4 template. I'm running Silverlight 5 beta on this particular machine, but that's okay. It just means I'll have to change one thing, customer app.silverlight is what I'm going to call this. And Silverlight 5. And I want to rename my web project. I'm going to automatically create this in a web project. Silverlight applications are typically hosted in a web project. Production applications pretty much always are hosted in a website of some sort because something needs to serve Silverlight up. In this case, it's also going to be the endpoint for our web services. So, this website is going to serve the Silverlight Zap up, but we're also going to talk back to that website to talk to our WCF service. All right, so now I have a website in there. Now what I need to change in the Silverlight project, just because it happens to be that Silverlight 4 template, you see the target Silverlight version here is 4. Say yes, because you can in fact target Silverlight 3, 4, or 5 if you have Silverlight 5 installed. So that's probably something useful for you to know. And it's going to reload that and do the conversion for me, which is nice. All right. The next thing I want to do here is I'm going to add some model projects. So remember what I said about working with POCOs as opposed to working with record sets and whatnot. My web service on my server is, in fact, going to return back POCOs. So let me show you really quickly here a quick slide that I did that has, here we go, that shows you what the architecture is going to look like. So and these are not tech ed approved slides, by the way. They didn't go through and kill all my formatting, as you can tell. So I have the Silverlight client, and it's going to talk to a model, which happens to have my 4 different classes in it that represent the entities in the database. And then it's also going to talk to a local service proxy that is going to communicate with the web service, which in turn is going to talk to the database. It seems a little bit more complex than what we had in Windows Forms. However, what I'm also trying to do here at the same time is impose a modern architecture on the application and use some modern patterns like MVVM. It's quite likely that you have Windows Forms code that's also using patterns. I remember doing MVC code in Windows Forms way back in the day. So I'm not saying that Windows Forms apps are unstructured, just that my particular one here happens to be pretty flat. And then also, and we're going to do just a unit test on this, but I'm going to duplicate a few things in here so you can see how if you had to target both Windows or both Silverlight and WPF or Silverlight and Windows Forms, some things that you're going to want to do to make sure that they can both talk to the same endpoints. All right, so let's get back over to this project. So I've got this customer app Silverlight. Now I'm going to add my model projects. And it's going to be customer, let's see, Silverlight class library, customer app.model.silverlight. Silverlight 5, yep. And then I'm going to add a customer app.model. Let's see, add new project. And this is going to be a Windows class library. So I'm going to have 2 side-by-side class libraries, one for Windows, one for Silverlight. So customer app.model. I'm just going to call it net. Silverlight's also .net. It's just a lightweight version of it. I'm going to delete these 2 class files out here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the properties for these projects and I'm going to change the default namespace. What I'm doing is a common trick for sharing code between both Silverlight and the full .NET framework, and you can also use the same trick for sharing code between Windows Phone as well as Silverlight as well as WPF as well as the full .NET framework running on a server. And that is I'm going to have 2 side-by-side projects that link to the same source files but are compiled against different versions of the framework. And in order to make that work, I really need to go into this, change the properties, and change the namespace to get rid of that last little .NET and .Silverlight property, or text. So now both of those have the same namespace. So if I create a file in one of them and reuse it in the other, I don't have any issues about namespace. Now, because watching me type is extremely painful, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to drag a couple of entities in this, and I'm going to drag them right over into this Silverlight project. And these entities are simply plain old objects. They're just plain objects that represent the data that's in the database. This is what's replacing our record sets in Silverlight. Okay. I have product, and I have sales order detail, and then I have sales order header. All right. Now, in my net project here, my main one, I am going to add some existing items, and I'm going to find those. And and here are the 4 files. And I'm going to add them as links. Have you guys done this before? All right. So now I am able to share the same source code between the two. Now, another nice trick I like to use that I'm not going to specifically need to use here, but using this approach as opposed to, say, like the portable library support that we also have, allows you to use whatever types of references you want to use. It also allows you to create partial classes that you can hang off of these entities and have specific functionality for either the WPF side or the ASP.NET side or the Silverlight side. So if I wanted to have some specific stuff that's not supported in Silverlight and I wanted to have that available on the server side, I can make this customer class a partial class. I can add a new class to my full .NET project that's also partial class from customer, and then that functionality will only exist on the full .NET version of this. Right. You can also use conditional compilation and stuff if you would like, but that tends to be a little messier. I don't know, honestly, on that. Each of the different source control products I know has some problem with this in some way so it's not like an immediate go in and it suddenly works. You do have to specifically tell it that these are linked files and not duplicate files, because yes, that'll get messy pretty quickly. All right, source control, that's for people that write code for a living. That's not for, all right. I know you guys are all getting ready to leave. I've totally lost all my credibility with you at this point. All right, so I've got these different model projects on here. And then the next thing I want to do is, how many of you have used Entity Framework? How many of you like Entity Framework? Oh, that's pretty good. I'm good. How many of you have used the Code First version? The new stuff that just came out that Scott Guthrie's been tweeting and blogging and everything about. Okay, awesome. How many of you have used NuGet? Oh, a surprising number of folks. That's great. You must have attended one of Hanselman's talks or something like that if you're using NuGet. So a lot of people don't realize that stuff like NuGet is available to Silverlight and WPF applications. So if I want to go in here and add a reference to Entity Framework Code First stuff, I can select, there we go. I can select the project I want to put it in, which in this case is going to be my web application. And I always forget the syntax of that. You can also use the GUI if you want. But I'm going to look at the entity framework stuff. So git package, remote entity. Oh, no, I have network. Do I have network access? Oh, phew. All right. This whole thing falls pretty flat pretty quickly if I don't have network access. So here are all the available projects that we can download, or available references we can download that include the word entity. You see, here's the old EF Code First. We wouldn't use that. Instead, what we're going to get is this entity framework package. So I'm going to install that. And what's really nice about NuGet is it installs it right into your project. It's not putting it anywhere else on your hard drive. It's not putting stuff in the GAC. It's not installing stuff to random directories or anything like that. So if I just do install package, actually I don't need to do remote for that. Entity framework. It's downloading it. And if I looked over here, on my web project, it's added the entity framework reference, so I'm all good to go there. So there's also the GUI version of that, which is available up in the tools menu. The command line version gets you access to being able to filter and sort things and whatnot. Or you can also go to nuget.org to actually just browse the packages and look there. But I think it's a really nice way to get access to open source packages, as well as the stuff that we've started publishing in there. So you'll find things like some of the Silverlight tools from us are in there, and the SDKs are in there, as well as things like Entity Framework and MEF and a bunch of other stuff that have been added in there and updated over the time. All right. So the next thing I want to do here is actually take my web project and add in what I need to be able to talk to the database. So the first one I'm going to add is a context, because I'm doing the code first approach, as opposed to dragging and dropping a database tables and creating an EDMX. That's perfectly viable as well, but it doesn't allow you to easily pull your model out into a separate project and do some of the things with testing and whatnot. You can do it. You can go and delete it and move it out and actually make it a POCO, but it's easier to go the code first route if you can. So I'm going to add a class, and I'm going to call it AdventureWorks Context. What would we do without AdventureWorks? Works context. All right? And again, because watching me type is super painful, I'm going to just go and delete that, drag that in there, and I'm good. Now, I also need to add a reference to the model that I've created. So this is my website, so I'm going to add a reference to the full .NET version of that model. So here's a project and model.net. That's good. Save that. Those are all resolved, so I'm good there. Now, my AdventureWorks context here, if you create an EDMX file by simply dragging and dropping onto the design surface, this is done for you. If you want to create a code first or go the POCO route or something like that, and you don't want to have a designer involved in this, and by designer I'm talking about the schema designer that's built into Entity Framework, then you have to create one of these yourself, and you have to set up the mappings. Anything that is not able to be intuited from your model, you need to set up in here. The nice thing about this is it does give you complete control over how your entities are mapped to the database entities, and it allows you to handle all the updating and everything else that you would need to do in here. All right, so now that I've got the context in there, I need to add a service. So I add a folder, call it services, and this is all in the web project still. And then I'm going to add a new item, and I'm going to go over to Silverlight here, and there is a type of service called a Silverlight enabled WCF service. There's also, if you do Ajax coding and stuff, there's a simple Ajax enabled WCF service as well. This is a really simple template that makes building WCF services very easy. Right? So typically, if you think about what it takes to build a WCF service, there's a lot of configuration, there's a lot of ceremony, separating out your interface separate from the actual implementation and whatnot. Those are not bad patterns to follow, but in many times it's just overkill that's getting in the way of what we're trying to accomplish. So a Silverlight-enabled WCF service is one that by default supports only what Silverlight supports. So it's basically a SOAP service. And it has the interface and the class all sort of rolled into one, and it sets the configuration up for you automatically. And we're going to call this customer data. So customer data. And again, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to add in, I'm going to wipe this out actually, because again, watching me type is painful. Here we go. All right. Don't you wish all code was that easy? Just drag it over from the box. It's funny, I had to recreate these 10 minutes before the talk because I went in and closed. Have you ever used snippets in Visual Studio, dragging them over there? If you have snippets in one version, one instance of, and anybody who's talked knows this one, if you have snippets in one instance of Visual Studio and you don't have them in the other, and you accidentally close the one that doesn't have any last, all your snippets go bye-bye, right? So I had to recreate them all just before we went there. So that was my fun thing. All right, so what I have in this service is I have a getCustomerById method that is going to use link here to operate on our context, operate on our AdventureWorks context. It's going to get a customer by the ID for that customer. I have a method here to get a list of customers. And notice all of these are returning lists of customers and lists of sales order details, and then individual customers, right? These are not returning record sets, and these aren't returning, just real simple data or anything like that. By having these collections or these arrays of entities come down to the client, we get a lot more functionality. We get a lot more with binding. We get a lot more, and we've been able to add in validation and whatnot later on. Okay? So I've got that service, and now what I'm going to need to do is add a couple of proxies to that. So let me build this to make sure we're all functional here. And there we go. Okay, good. All right. I didn't want to go any further. Always, when you're going to start working with services, always build your project before you start adding reference to the service. If you don't build your project first, a lot of times you'll get an error when you try and add a reference to that service from the other projects. Okay. So let me add customerapp.services. And this is going to be a new Silverlight class library. This will be customerapp.services.silverlight. And I'm going to do the same thing I did before, Silverlight 5, where I'm going to have two of these projects side by side. So delete that. Yep. And I'm going to add in the customerapp.services.net. Oh, excuse me. And this is Windows, class library, customer app, .services.net. Okay, and delete that. I'm sure you know what I'm going to do next. I'm going to go in here and add a file. And this is going to be my customer service. So what I need is customer data service. And this is going to be my proxy to be able to get to the web service. Now I pulled it out into a separate project so it can be reused from both WPF and Silverlight, or more importantly, reused from standard unit testing tools, a lot of which don't support Silverlight at this point, as well as if you want to use it from anything else that uses a full dot. XAML, excuse me. Delete. You guys were just going to let me do that. All right, add, new item, code, class, customer, data, service. There we go. All right, so I've got this customer data service, and I want to actually put some code in here. So let me delete this out. Here is some code for this. And I'm going to need to, let me do this. Delete. I'm going to need to also add references to the model from this so that it knows what it's talking to from the model. And then I'm going to need to add references to the web service. Now, you're going to want to add the reference to your model first, because if you don't do that, when you add a reference to the web service, it's going to generate all of those classes for you as proxies from the web service. If you add a reference to the model first, it'll see that those are there, and it's not going to duplicate all of those for you. I mean, that's a reversible operation. You can always go in and correct the reference afterwards, but you might not immediately understand what's going on. So in the Silverlight project, I'm going to add reference and to projects, and it's going to be customerapp.model.silverlight. And then over in my customerapp.services.net, I'm going to add existing item. And it's going to be a link over to the Silverlight one. Add it as a link. All right. And then this is also going to have a reference to a model. So add reference, projects, model.net. Okay. So what I've got so far here then is I have these two service proxy classes that are on the client. They each have a reference to the appropriate model based upon the version of the framework that they are compiled against. The next thing I'm going to do is add a reference to the service itself. So in the Silverlight project, I'm going to say add service reference. I hit discover here, and I've got this customer data service, and I'm just going to call this services. And by default, all the settings that happen in Silverlight are exactly what I want. I will have to modify some of these when I go in and add the reference on the full desktop side. So great, I have references there. Now let's go to the full desktop one, add service reference, same thing, discover, and I want services. And now, to be compatible with what's going to be generated by Silverlight, I'm going to have to do a couple of things. First of all, I'm going to have it generate asynchronous operations because Silverlight lets you make network calls that are asynchronous only. So the code that I'm using that's common between these is making an asynchronous network call to the server. That, probably more than anything else, is going to be one of your largest learning curves when you move from Windows Forms to Silverlight, is coding everything asynchronously. You can't really perform blocking operations in Silverlight because then the UI doesn't refresh and you end up with all sorts of disgruntled users. And in many cases, especially networking, you are simply not allowed to make a blocking call. It's not that you don't want to, it's you're not allowed to. You're going to have to make it as an asynchronous call. The second thing I want to do here is, instead of using system.array, I'm going to use observable collection, which is the default in Silverlight. That's entirely up to you. I'm using it so I don't have to go and iterate through a bunch of stuff and copy it over to an observable collection afterwards. I can simply do an assignment. An observable collection, if you're not familiar with it, is something that both WPF and Silverlight use to have a collection that will notify anybody who's bound to it when new items are added or existing items are deleted. So every time you add an item to the collection, it raises an event. Every time you delete an item from the collection, it raises an event. And that's how the UI can get updated very easily. Right, and the reuse types in all reference assemblies, that is what is enabling me to reuse the model that I have referenced, as opposed to having it regenerate all of those for me. All right, services, here we go. All right, and we'll give that another quick build here. Now, customer data, let's see, customer data client. Did I not have the, let's check that service reference. Did I not check that off? Oops. Oh, I didn't. Thank you very much. That's an excellent point in the back. All right. So let me go customer services, net properties. Thank you. All right. So, yeah, I meant to do that. I simply didn't change the namespace on here so that the reference, so when that proxy was generated by the add reference dialog, it generated it in that namespace. It didn't generate it in the namespace that I want it to. So I'm going to have to do the same thing over here on the Silverlight side. Services, properties, and get rid of that. And then I can refresh those service references, and I'm good. So service references, update service reference, good. And Silverlight, services, update service reference, hopefully good. Let's see here. Build this again. And yay, the magic squigglies went away. The magic squigglies are kind of like the blue smoke if you do electronics. It's like if you let the blue smoke out, you know that your electronics aren't going to work anymore. Okay. It's the magic blue smoke. That's what most electronics work off of. All right. So I have here, again, what I'm saying is I have these two parallel projects. Again, looking at this. I have the model.silverlight, and I have the service.silverlight, and I have the service.net and the model.net, and they are pointing to this WCF web service, and that in turn is pointing to the database. Now, I've written a lot of stuff here, and I haven't tested anything yet, so I've said, well, it compiles, so it must work. So I at least want to have something in there that I can test against. Now, there are unit testing solutions for Silverlight, but chances are it's probably not the one that you prefer. So if you can do this side-by-side compiling and unit test against your full .NET assemblies, granted, you are not unit testing everything in your project, but when you're doing this kind of smoke testing, I think it helps. Then you can use the unit test products that you like to use and just use them against regular .NET stuff and make the perhaps bad assumption that the Silverlight stuff is going to work, but at least understand that your logic is sound, if not the actual compiled assemblies there. All right. So what I want to do then is I want to add a test project that I can use to test. So I'm going to add a new project. I'm going to go to test. It's a test project. There we go. And inside here, I'm going to add a test method. So let me get rid of this particular test method. And then I'm going to have to add some references. So this here has some kind of nasty code in it for dealing with asynchronous testing. And I'll make sure that all this code's available as part of the download you'll get here from TechEd, and if not there, then via my blog, right? But this is doing a little bit of trickery to wait for an asynchronous call to come back. If you think about it, the normal mode of operation for testing something is, fire off the method, wait for the result to come back, and then make a decision based upon that result that you see. Well, that doesn't work too well if you're working with asynchronous operations. You have to go fire the event off, and then something has to wait for that result to come back. That's why we use one of the reasons why we do a lot with data binding in Silverlight, because we can simply fire off a call, and when the data comes back, it'll simply refresh the collection and it'll automatically bind to our UI. We don't have to get back from that. But in unit testing, it's a little bit different because you want a yay or nay at the end of the unit test. So let me go in and add a couple references to this test project, and then we'll see what it looks like. So I'm going to say add reference, and for projects here, I want it to reference my model, and I want it to reference my services. And then I want to reset or resolve that using system threading. And I'm going to resolve that. There. All right. And now what this is going to do, if we walk through it, so it creates this thing called a wait handle on this auto reset event. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow this method to wait until, for a certain time here until I set this as completed. And then I have an event handler where I say that's the service customer loaded, and my service, which we'll look at that code in a second, has a customer loaded event that tells you when the customer has information is backed down from the service. Hey, if that comes back and the customer is not null, then it's going to set this, and then we're all happy and all good, right? If it doesn't work in, what's that, about 10 seconds or whatever there, if it doesn't come back in that amount of time, then we're going to get a test timeout. The main thing that I'm doing here is just making sure that my data works and I'm getting something back. There are multiple ways to do this. You can also, if you want to, create a console application or whatever makes you happy. So let me go in and test, say run all tests in solution, and let's see if my code works. No, let's see. Let's look at the details. Okay. Okay. So what I didn't do, it's funny because I thought about it before I started talking. One of the things I didn't do is the client configuration file that tells you where this WCF service is isn't actually over here in my test project, right? It's over there in my library project. So if I go over to my services.net and I look at the app.config, I can take that and copy it and then go over to the test project and paste that. I can also do it as a link if I wanted to. And now I actually have an endpoint that I can work with. That was automatically added as part of the add service reference process. So let's do test, run, all test in solution. And it's going through. Oh, still not working. It's taking too long here. Let's try this one more time. Build, rebuild solution. Close this. And if my test fails too much, then I have a backup project I'll use. Let's try this again. Isn't that the definition of insanity? Do it more than once and expect a different result? Okay. All right, so let's take a look here real quick. Let me look at my app.config. That's coming back. No, okay. Let me go in and pull up the backup project. Hey, if I have a backup project, just for reference, when you're doing your evals, if I have a backup project, it doesn't actually count as a demo failure. So let's go back up here, and here is my test service. Let me go in there and copy some stuff out real quick. I have an SSD, so it copies fairly quickly. And paste. And then we can all do the countdown. 5, 4, 3. All right. So I'd have to check and see what I did there, but some likely suspects were, let's do this. Some likely suspects where something was taking too long, I didn't have the configuration file right, or actually quite possibly, I know exactly what I did wrong, but of course now this is going to copy over it. What I didn't do is I didn't add into my web.config the connection string from my, close, try again. I didn't add in the connection string to my web.config, right? So unfortunately the error message that came back was not particularly helpful, but I didn't tell the web service on my website what to use to connect to that entity framework library, or connect to that database. All right, well, let's pull this up again anyway. Let's run this and run all tests in solution. So test, run all tests in solution. All right, now that's bizarre. Let me take a look at that web.config real quick. Web.config. And let's make sure that I've got documents, presentation, new. Okay, so that's fine. That's really weird. All right. I will tell you that this did work 10 minutes before this talk. Let's try one more thing. Make sure that's good. I've got that. Let's look at the test project. The app.config there is fine. All right, we may just have to move on. All right. So what I was going to show you here is unit testing this project. I guess if you pull your backup project in and it still doesn't work, then that probably counts as a demo failure, right? But what I was going to show you here is the simple unit test for your project. The concept of unit testing appears to have worked because it has shown that, in fact, my stuff here doesn't work. What I didn't want to do is get all the way down to the Silverlight application and find out that didn't work. Let me pull up one of the other projects here just for grins to see if it'll work directly from there, because there might just be a pathing issue or something like that. Windows Forms, backup, and let me go to test service. Directly, pull that up. Test, run, all tests in solution. If that still fails, that'll be kind of cool. That's a triple. That's a hat trick, isn't it? Yeah, okay, I think I've won. There's got to be some sort of prize I can get for that. All right. Okay. Let me move on to the next step in this. And I want to start creating the user interface. We've got a couple of minutes here. And pull up this project and see if this comes up. All right. So in the next step after that is I am creating the user interface for the Silverlight side of the application. And this could end up being a short demo if the database here still doesn't work, because that would be, like I said, pretty bizarre. Oh, you know what? I should close my other instance because I bet there's some conflicts in which web port is being used. Go. My machine's too new to be tired. It's only a week old. It can't be tired already. Okay, so what I want to do next here is go into the Silverlight client on this, and I'm going to add in some views and some view models. So I've got that list that first came up in the Windows Forms application, if you remember, where you go into the application and you get a list of all the customers that are in the database, or you can filter it by name. So what I've done here is I have created a customer list child window. So here's the customer list child window. If we take a look at the design for that, all this has in it is a list box. The previous version, the Windows Forms version, used a list view. Most of the things that you were using list views for in Windows Forms can be done with a list box in Silverlight. And list box is actually a lot more flexible because you can display the elements as different sizes. You can display them, with images in there and all sorts of stuff. Really, the layout is entirely up to you. It's really all the list box defines is the fact that there is a list of items, a collection of items in here, and the presentation is up to you. Again, if you take a look at the Silverlight 5 talk I did earlier, the talk on data templates shows specifically how you can mix and match different types of data and different types of elements inside the same list box. So I've got this, this form, which this is a child window. It's something that we can use to pop up inside of Silverlight. Silverlight 5 has also added in the ability to create real windows that pop up above everything else. So you could use those if you want, but those windows can't be modal, right? A child window can look modal for the main Silverlight canvas because it goes and grays everything else out that's behind it, and it also disables it. It's just fooling you. It's not really modal, but at least gives you the appearance of that. A true window in Silverlight cannot be modal, so in fact, this would be a better choice for anything that we need actually a dialog result from. And then what I've also added in here is this customer list view model. How many of you are familiar with the MVVM pattern? Excellent. So, MVVM is a bit of a spectrum of implementations of that pattern, and I've taken a pretty lightweight approach to it here, and you can go nuts with it and go all the way to the end and have IOC containers and a lot of very highly decoupled tiers in your application and runtime resolution of which types of objects to pull in and whatnot, and that's all excellent. But what I did here is a real basic implementation, just to let you know that if you do this much of an implementation in your Silverlight application, you will make your life a whole lot easier. Because Silverlight works best if what you want to bind the UI to is external to the UI that you're working on. So if you have stuff in your code behind that you want to bind the UI to, it can get pretty messy trying to figure out the path to get to some of those things in the code behind. And you start with dealing with like ancestor relative source and start dealing with different ways of referencing things that are in your code behind and properties and whatnot in there. If you externalize that and you have a view model that has everything that your screen needs to operate, all the methods, as well as all the bits of data, then it's very easy for you to do two-way binding between that as well as commanding. So even if that's all you do from the MVVM pattern, if that's all you take from that and use that in Silverlight, it's going to make your life a whole lot easier. So I hope you can you follow that in building your own applications. The other thing I've done is I have created just an observable-based class. If you use an MVVM toolkit, it usually has these types of things built in. And what the observable-based class allows me to do is raise this notify property change event that's specified by iNotify property change. And that is how the binding system in Silverlight knows that the fields have been updated. Now you'll notice that if we look back at my model, I didn't put in any iNotify property change stuff inside this model. Whether or not you want to do that depends on a couple of things. What your opinion is of it, first of all. For some people, that feels really dirty, and they don't want to pollute their model with those types of things. In those cases, they have to create separate view model versions of each of their entities, which is a lot of work, so it depends on which place you would rather be. The second thing is that in my UI here, I am not going to rely on individual properties changing to update the UI. So if you do not have anything else that is going to be modifying the properties behind the scenes in your objects, if you have nothing else that's doing that, you don't necessarily need to implement iNotify property change, because the only thing that's going to be triggering a change in those properties is through the text box that the user is typing in anyway. So if the user is typing in something in a text box, they already have that value in a text box. However, if you're doing something that is calculated based on other fields, or you're doing something that might be updated based on some sort of external trigger, at least for those properties, you're going to need to implement iNotify property change in order to get those updates back over to the UI. And again, if you want to, you could leave all of your other properties alone in here, create a partial class that has the calculated properties with the iNotify property change implementation in it, and that way you've left your POCOs alone and you haven't polluted them with any kind of other Silverlight and WPF plumbing. Okay? So let me go in here and take a look at the application. Let's set our Silverlight application here to start up. So we get that, Silverlight test page. Set a start page. Somebody in the back say a prayer that the database is behaving. And if somebody knew what was wrong there and is just not telling me, I will hunt you down. Okay. So here is that Silverlight application template, and I've added in a Find Customer button on there. If I click on Find Customer, it pops up this customer list. And then I can type in, let's see, this was the central, let's see, fine, and cross my fingers. Oh, yes, excellent, sorry. That's my, that right there is a victory, so I'm happy. All right. Most of us take more than an hour to code our solutions, so I'm going to claim demo messy up stuff here. Anyway, so I'm going to take the central bicyclist, and I'm going to, oh, okay. That's okay, I know what that is. I told you this would be an interesting after lunch session. I know exactly what that is. It's something I need to put in for mapping in the UI, which I'll do in just a second. So it in fact pulled up exactly what it was supposed to pull up, right? The thing is, I don't have the other page for it to go to yet, so that's not a surprising error that I haven't set up the mapping to get to the other page, and I actually haven't set up the other page for it to go to. So now let's go in and put in the Silverlight application the page itself that's going to show the details for the customer. So if I go to customer app.silverlight, and in my view folder, I add a new item. And this is going to be a Silverlight page. The Silverlight has a built-in navigation framework that works with the URLs in the browser. It also works out of browser. If your application can fit into that navigation framework, you get a ton of stuff for free, like deep linking into parts of your application, something that I personally have had to implement in Windows Forms way back, where customers wanted to be able to email a link to a specific customer. And so you had to go in and one way was we had to implement a specific protocol, which is not fun. You have to go in and hack a bunch of stuff in the registry to do that. And have it pull up the application if that's read, and then load up that customer and pass in the customer ID and all that stuff. In Silverlight, it's really easy because if you get that URL, you can just give that URL to somebody else, and they will get access to that page in your application with the right data loaded automatically. So I think that's pretty cool. It's a little different than HTML. It's not like the passing in customer 1, 2, 3 is doing any special work for you. It's simply passing the information to your page, and you're responsible for spinning up and loading based on that. All right, so Silverlight page, and this is going to be customer details. So customer details view. And this is empty at the moment, so I'm going to go in and drag some more UI in here. We can pretend I have a virtual graphics designer sitting over here on the left, right? So, and you're going to see in a second here that we should probably fire them. Here's the UI. My machine's acting very funny here. There we go. Thank you. Okay. So here's the UI, and you see that it's pretty similar to what we had in the Windows Forms application. We have a bunch of text boxes up at the top that are data bound to elements that are in our view model. So if I look at the XAML here and look at the company name, for example, here we have binding customer.lastname, two-way binding. We have binding for first name, etc. So this is how I am getting data back and forth from my view model. Now I need to add a view model, so the customer details view model, add new item, and this is going to be the Silverlight class, customer details view model. Right? And then I am going to go in and add some code to this, so let me get rid of that, of course. Oops, let me get rid of that, of course. There we go. And here's my customer. I'll fix that in a second. Customer details view model, and delete all that. Also, when you are reusing code between Silverlight and WPF or Silverlight and the web and stuff, go in here and clean up your usings before you go in, if you're using the shared source approach, because by default when you create classes in Silverlight, it has a lot of Silverlight specific stuff up in your using statements, and that just doesn't make any sense to have up in your web project. You don't want to be importing a bunch of that stuff into your files. And in fact, it can also make it sometimes difficult to reuse stuff if you're referencing something that simply isn't available in the platform that you're targeting. All right, so here's my view model. It also implements observable like before. It has a single customer that is the current customer that we're operating on. Then it has a collection of sales order headers. Those are the items that go on that list box on the left. A collection of sales order details, which are the sales order headers for the current sales order detail. You could also have hung this off the sales order header and had just sort of a deep hierarchy of that. Either way, it works just fine. Then I have the selected sales order header. Then I have a function in here to load the customer that's going to call out and load that customer. And then I have some functions to load the sales order details, as well as to load those headers. Then finally, I'm going to comment this out for the moment. I have some functions for doing the mail merge stuff, and a function to save. Okay? So with that in there, with having the customer details view model in there and having the customer details page, the only thing that's left now is I have to provide the mapping over in the user interface to be able to tell it how to find my new page. Now, by default, there's a default mapping that if you don't mind having the URL to your page just be something.xaml with no parameters, that works fine. But if you want to support parameters and have a cleaner name, then you have to add your own map in there. So if I go over to my over to my main page, and I look over in my navigation frame, all right, and then I go in and add the URI mapping, which is right here. This URI mapping tells it that if I am passed in something called customer details view / and then some parameter, that it in fact should map that to the views folder, customer details view.xaml customer ID equals parameter. If you've done URL routing and stuff in ASP.NET, this is very, very similar to that, and it serves a very similar purpose. All right, so let's run this. Make sure we're all good. Oh, let's see. Oh, no, I don't want to do that. Let me see what failed. Oh, I don't have an event handler set for one of the buttons. That's okay. Let me fix that. Stop. Go. What is up with my machine? Okay. All right, so I need to go over to my customer details view, or my customer details view, and I need to put some code behind in there. Now, I'm not real strict about having code behind or not. I think it's perfectly okay to have code behind in some cases. I'm saying that because I'm demoing you something with code behind it, and I don't want to look like I don't know what I'm doing. All right, so here is the code behind for my customer details view, and inside this I have a reference to my view model, and then I set the data context of this view to be my view model, so that anything that I update inside the view model is going to be what's used to update the bindings on the UI. And then on the onNavigated_to method for this, I am going to take that customer ID that came in from the URL in the query string parameters, and we're still calling it query string even when you're running out of browser. Again, this still works fine there. And then I'm going to call the load customer method on my view model to pull up that specific customer. Again, this gives you that deep linking support automatically. And then I've got this method here to generate a form letter, which we'll look at last. All right, so make sure we're good with this. There we go. All right, so let's find the customer, and I'm going to pull up this central bicyclist. And I'm going to pull up this one right here. I hit OK. Let's see this here. Oh, customer details view, and I bet I named it customer detail view over in that form. Let me take a quick look. Pull up. There we go. Pull up. Customer details view.xaml. Customer details view. No, that's also. Oh, all right, that's the second one today. All right, let's work on this some more. Let's go over to here, since we only have a couple minutes left, and I want you to have time for questions as well. Let me go over to this final version of this. It was just saying that it couldn't find that page, so it essentially means I had a typo somewhere in what I typed in for a URL or something like that, or the page name itself, or the class name for the page name. All right, so here is the final version of this application, and the only two additional things that I've added in here that you didn't see already were over in the customer details view model. I've wired up this save method that calls over to my service. So if I go customer app services Silverlight, I have this save customer, which calls up to my web service, and simply calls that the update customer async method on that web service. The second thing I added, which I think is slightly more interesting, is I added in this letter creation service. And by service, I'm using it in the generic way. It's a service that's on the client. And what this letter creation service does is it uses the COM automation support that's built into Silverlight to be able to automate Microsoft Word and be able to create this letter. Now, because this is dynamic, you're not going to get any IntelliSense on any of this. So the easiest way to do this is to take your Windows Forms application or console application or something like that, add a reference to the Word automation libraries, put all your code in, then paste it in here, and then pull out the strict types for this create object here at the top, and then use dynamic in front of anything else that you're creating. It's a fairly small change, but I think creating it outside of Silverlight first will make it much easier for you to get something working inside Silverlight. So let me run this just to make sure we're good, and then we'll wrap it up. And the working version of this code, I also made this an out-of-browser app because I had to support that in order to have the automation, right? Unless I wanted to do the new stuff in Silverlight 5. The working version of this code will be made available to you guys, so I'm not going to leave you with all the ones that sort of didn't work a little bit there. Unless you want to. I can send them all to you if you'd like. All right, so here's my central bicyclist. Hit OK. Pull that up. I'm good. If I want to say updated for this one, I can tab off that. Let me save that. If I want to do the form letter, we saw that earlier. I don't want to save it. Let me close this, or let me find this customer again and type central bicyclists. And you see it's been updated on there. Right? So the way that I did all of those CRUD operations were again through Entity Framework code first, doing some very simple object mapping in the back end. that was fronted by a web service, right? That web service in turn was fronted by a proxy on the client that abstracts away the fact that this is a web service call. And I made 2 of those. One of those was for the full .NET framework. One of those was for Silverlight. Then stepping back a little bit more from that, I had the model objects that were used both by those service calls as well as by my web service itself, so they're all sharing the same entity definitions all across the board. And then in the Silverlight client, I'm also using that same model, and my view models are referencing the service proxy on the client to be able to talk to that web service. So I think this is a reasonable pattern, keeping it, it seems somewhat strong, but if you don't need to support another type of client, if you don't need to, say, port your Windows Forms code along at the same time or support WPF, you can eliminate the second service proxy on the client, but you're still going to need the second model for your server-side stuff. But I think this is a fairly decent pattern for moving forward and pulling your Windows Forms applications over into Silverlight. So let me just wrap this up here. So what's next? I've got a bunch of tutorials up on Silverlight.net that I'd encourage you to check out. I'm trying to do more stuff that's oriented towards getting Windows Forms developers up to speed on Silverlight. So if you have specific suggestions for me, things that you are having difficulty with or questions that you have about how to do something in Silverlight versus the way it was done in Windows Forms, please email me. My email address is pete.brown@microsoft.com, or you can tweet me at Pete_Brown. I'll pimp my book here. I have Silverlight 4 in action. It's down for sale in the store. I've been told it's a decent book. It certainly makes a good doorstop if you don't like the text that's in it. It's a pretty thick book. And then you want to go in and learn the basics of XAML UI development, and you also want to learn how to do async operations in Silverlight. Those 2 things are going to be the 2 biggest things that you need to understand and internalize, and all the rest of it is basically just .NET. Okay? All right, well, thank you very much. And can I do a Jedi mind trick on you before you go and do the evals? The demos all work. They all work. Thank you, everybody.